His voice broke, and his whole body quivered. I saw, oh, the burning shame of it, evil that is without shape, that is formless. Suddenly he straightened and looked wildly about him. They will come here and claim him, he cried. They have laid their mark upon him, and they will come for him. You must not stay here. This house is marked for destruction. I watched him helplessly as he seized his hat and bag and crossed to the door. With white, shaking fingers, he drew back the latch, and in a moment his lean figure was silhouetted against a square of swirling vapor. "Remember that I warned you," he shouted back, and then the fog swallowed him. Howard was sitting and rubbing his eyes. "A malicious trick, that," he was muttering, "to deliberately drug me. Had I known that glass of water—" "How do you feel?" I asked as I shook him violently by the shoulders. "Do you think you can walk?" "You drug me and then ask me to walk? Frank, you're as unreasonable as an artist. What is the matter now?" I pointed to the silent figure on the table. "Mulligan Wood is safer," I said. "He belongs to them now." Howard sprang to his feet and shook me by the arm. "What do you mean?" he cried. "How do you know?" "The doctor saw his brain," I explained, "and he also saw something that he could not describe. But he told me they would come for him, and I believe him." "We must leave here at once," cried Howard. "Your doctor was right. We are in deadly danger. Even Mulligan would, but we need not return to the wood. There is your launch." "There is the launch," I echoed, faint hope rising in my mind. "The fog will be a most deadly menace," said Howard grimly. "But even death at sea is preferable to this horror." It was not far from the house to the dock, and in less than a minute Howard was seated in the stern of the launch, and I was working furiously on the engine. The foghorns still moaned, but there were no lights visible anywhere in the harbor. We could not see 2 feet before our faces. The white wraiths of the fog were dimly visible in the darkness, but beyond them stretched endless night, lightless and full of terror. Howard was speaking. "Somehow I feel that there is death out there," he said. "There is more death here," I said as I started the engine. "I think I can avoid the rocks. There's very little wind, and I know the harbor." "And of course we shall have the foghorns to guide us," muttered Howard. "I think we had better make for the open sea." I agreed. We moved slowly into the channel, and the sound of the water splashing against the sides of the launch soothed us strangely. At a suggestion from me, Howard had taken the wheel and was slowly bringing her about. "Keep her steady!" I shouted. "There isn't any danger until we get to the Narrows." For several minutes I crouched above the engine, while Howard steered in silence. Then suddenly he turned to me with a gesture of elation. "I think the fog's lifting," he said. I stared into the darkness before me. Certainly it seemed less oppressive, and the white spirals of mist that had been continually ascending through it were fading into insubstantial wisps. "Keep her head on," I shouted. "We're in luck. If the fog clears, we'll be able to see the Narrows. Keep a sharp lookout for Mulligan Light." There is no describing the joy that filled us when we saw the light. Yellow and bright, it streamed over the water and illuminated sharply the outlines of the great rocks that rose on both sides of the Narrows. "Let me have the wheel," I shouted as I stepped quickly forward. "This is a ticklish passage, but we'll come through now with colors flying." In our excitement and elation, we almost forgot the horror that we had left behind us. I stood at the wheel and smiled confidently as we raced over the dark water. Quickly the rocks drew nearer until their vast bulk towered over us. "We shall certainly make it," I cried. But no response came from Howard. I heard him choke and gasp. "What's the matter?" I asked suddenly, and turning saw that he was crouching in terror above the engine. His back was turned toward me, but I knew instinctively in which direction he was gazing. The dim shore we had left shone like a flaming sunset. Mulligan Wood was burning. Great flames shot up from the highest of the tall trees, and a thick curtain of black smoke rolled slowly eastward. blotting out the few remaining lights in the harbor. But it was not the flames that caused me to cry out in fear and horror. It was the shape that towered above the trees, the vast, formless shape that moved slowly to and fro across the sky. God knows I tried to believe that I saw nothing. I tried to believe that the shape was a mere shadow cast by the flames, and I remember that I gripped Howard's arm reassuringly. "The wood will be destroyed completely," I cried, "and those ghastly things with us will be destroyed with it." But when Howard turned and shook his head, I knew that the dim, formless thing that towered above the trees was more than a shadow. "If we see it clearly, we are lost," he warned, his voice vibrant with terror. "Pray that it remains without form." It is older than the world, I thought, older than all religion. Before the dawn of civilization, men knelt in adoration before it. It is present in all mythologies. It is the primal symbol. Perhaps in the dim past, thousands and thousands of years ago, it was used to repel the invaders. I shall fight the shape with a high and terrible mystery. Suddenly I became curiously calm. I knew that I had hardly a minute to act, that more than our lives were threatened, but I did not tremble. I reached calmly beneath the engine and drew out a quantity of cotton waste. "Howard," I said, "light a match. It is our only hope. You must strike a match at once." For what seemed eternities, Howard stared at me uncomprehendingly. Then the night was clamorous with his laughter. "A match!" he shrieked. "A match to warm our little brains! Yes, we shall need a match." "Trust me," I entreated. "You must. It is our only hope. Strike a match quickly." "I do not understand." Howard was sober now, but his voice quivered. "I have thought of something that may save us," I said. "Please light this waste for me." Slowly he nodded. I had told him nothing, but I knew he guessed what I intended to do. Often his insight was uncanny. With fumbling fingers, he drew out a match and struck it. "Be bold," he said. "Show them that you are unafraid. Make the sign boldly." As the waste caught fire, the form above the trees stood out with a frightful clarity. I raised the flaming cotton and passed it quickly before my body in a straight line from my left to my right shoulder. Then I raised it to my forehead and lowered it to my knees. In an instant, Howard had snatched the brand and was repeating the sign. He made 2 crosses, one against his body and one against the darkness with the torch held at arm's length. For a moment I shut my eyes, but I could still see the shape above the trees. Then slowly its form became less distinct, became vast and chaotic, and when I opened my eyes, it had vanished. I saw nothing but the flaming forest and the shadows cast by the tall trees. The horror had passed, but I did not move. I stood like an image of stone staring over the black water. Then something seemed to burst in my head. My brain spun dizzily, and I tottered against the rail. I would have fallen, but Howard caught me about the shoulders. "We're saved!" he shouted. "We've won through!" "I'm glad," I said, but I was too utterly exhausted to really rejoice. My legs gave way beneath me, and my head fell forward. All the sights and sounds of earth were swallowed up in a merciful blackness. Part 2. Howard was writing when I entered the room. "How is the story going?" I asked. For a moment he ignored my question. Then he slowly turned and faced me. He was hollow-eyed, and his pallor was alarming. "It's not going well," he said at last. "It doesn't satisfy me. There are problems that still elude me. I haven't been able to capture all of the horror of the thing in Mulligan Wood." I sat down and lit a cigarette. "I want you to explain that horror to me," I said. "For 3 weeks I have waited for you to speak. I know that you have some knowledge which you are concealing from me. What was the damp, spongy thing that landed on Wells's head in the woods? Why did we hear a droning as we fled in the fog? What was the meaning of the shape that we saw above the trees? And why, in heaven's name, didn't the horror spread as we feared it might? What stopped it? Howard, what do you think really happened to Wells's brain? Did his body burn with the farm? Or did they claim it? And the other body that was found in Mulligan Wood, that lean, blackened horror with the riddled head, how do you explain that? 2 days after the fire, a skeleton had been found in Mulligan Wood. A few fragments of burnt flesh still adhered to the bones, and the skullcap was missing. It was a long time before Howard spoke again. He sat with bowed head, fingering his notebook, and his body trembled all over. At last he raised his eyes. They shone with a wild light, and his lips were ashen. "Yes," he said, "we will discuss the horror together. Last week I did not want to speak of it. It seemed too awful to put into words. But I shall never rest in peace until I have woven it into a story, until I have made my readers feel and see that dreadful, unspeakable thing, and I cannot write of it until I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that I understand it myself. It may help me to talk about it. You have asked me what the damp thing was that fell on Wells's head. I believe that it was a human brain, the essence of a human brain drawn out through a hole or holes in a human head. I believe the brain was drawn out by imperceptible degrees and reconstructed again by the horror. I believe that for some purpose of its own, it used human brains, perhaps to learn from them, or perhaps it merely played with them. The blackened, riddled body in Mulligan Wood? That was the body of the first victim, some poor fool who got lost between the tall trees. I rather suspect the trees helped. I think the horror endowed them with a strange life. Anyhow, the poor chap lost his brain. The horror took it and played with it, and then accidentally dropped it. It dropped it on Wells's head. Wells said that the long, thin, and very white arm he saw was looking for something that it had dropped. Of course, Wells didn't really see the arm objectively, but the horror that is without form or color had already entered his brain and clothed itself in human thought. As for the droning we heard and the shape we thought we saw above the burning forest, that was the horror seeking to make itself felt, seeking to break down barriers, seeking to enter our brains and clothe itself with our thoughts. It almost got us. If we had seen the white arm, we should have been lost. Howard walked to the window. He drew back the curtains and gazed for a moment at the crowded harbor and the tall white buildings that towered against the moon. He was staring at the skyline of lower Manhattan. Sheer beneath him, the cliffs of Brooklyn Heights loomed darkly. "Why didn't they conquer?" he cried. "They could have destroyed us utterly. They could have wiped us from Earth. All our power and wealth would have gone down before them." I shivered. "Yes, why didn't the horror spread?" I asked. Howard shrugged his shoulders. "I do not know. Perhaps they discovered that human brains were too trivial and absurd to bother with. Perhaps we ceased to amuse them. Perhaps they grew tired of us. But it is conceivable that the sign destroyed them or sent them back through space. I think they came millions of years ago and were frightened away by the sign. When they discovered we had not forgotten the use of the sign, they may have fled in terror. Certainly, there has been no manifestation for 3 weeks. I think that they are gone." "And Henry Wells?" I asked. "Well, his body was not found. I imagine they came for him." "And you honestly intend to put this obscenity into a story? Oh my God, the whole thing is so incredible, so unheard of that I can't believe it. Did we not dream it all? Were we ever really in Partridgeville? Did we sit in an ancient house and discuss frightful things while the fog curled about us? Did we walk through that unholy wood? Were the trees really alive? And did Henry Wells run about on his hands and knees like a wolf?" Howard sat down quietly and rolled up his sleeve. He thrust his thin arm toward me. "Can you argue away that scar?" he said. "There are the marks of the beast that attacked me, the man-beast. That was Henry Wells. A dream? I would cut off this arm immediately at the elbow if you could convince me that it was a dream." I walked to the window and remained for a long time staring at Manhattan. There, I thought, is something substantial. It is absurd to imagine that anything could destroy it. It is absurd to imagine that the horror was really as terrible as it seemed to us in Partridgeville. I must persuade Howard not to write about it. We must both try to forget it. I returned to where he sat and laid my hand on his shoulder. "You'll never give up the idea of putting it into a story?" I urged gently. "Never." He was on his feet and his eyes were blazing. "Do you think I would give up now when I've almost captured it? I shall write a story that will penetrate to the inmost core of a horror that is without form and substance, but more terrible than a plague-stricken city when the cadences of a tolling bell sound an end to all hope. I shall surpass Poe. I shall surpass all the masters." "Surpass them and be damned, then," I said angrily. "That way madness lies. But it is useless to argue with you. Your egoism is too colossal." I turned and walked swiftly out of the room. It occurred to me as I descended the stairs that I had made an idiot of myself with my fears. But even as I went down, I looked fearfully back over my shoulder, as though I expected a great stone weight to descend from above and crush me to the earth. He should forget the honor, I thought. He should wipe it from his mind. He will go mad if he writes about it. 3 days passed before I saw Howard again. "Come in," he said in a curiously hoarse voice when I knocked on his door. I found him in dressing gown and slippers, and I knew as soon as I saw him that he was terribly exultant. "I have triumphed, Frank," he cried. "I have reproduced the form that is formless, the burning shame that man has not looked upon, the crawling, fleshless obscenity that sucks at our brains." Before I could so much as gasp, he placed the bulky manuscript in my hands. "Read it, Frank," he commanded. "Sit down at once and read it." I crossed to the window and sat down on the lounge. I sat there oblivious to everything but the typewritten sheets before me. I confess that I was consumed with curiosity. I had never questioned Howard's power. With words he wrought miracles. Breaths from the unknown blew always over his pages, and things that had passed beyond earth returned at his bidding. But could he even suggest the horror that we had known? Could he even so much as hint at the loathsome, crawling thing that had claimed the brain of Henry Wells? I read the story through. I read it slowly and clutched at the pillows beside me in a frenzy of loathing. As soon as I finished it, Howard snatched it from me. He evidently suspected that I desired to tear it to shreds. "What do you think of it?" he cried exultantly. "It is indescribably foul," I exclaimed. "It violates privacies of the mind that should never be laid bare." "But you will concede that I have made the horror convincing?" I nodded and reached for my hat. "You have made it so convincing that I cannot remain and discuss it with you. I intend to walk until morning. I intend to walk until I am too weary to care, or think, or remember." "It is a very great story!" he shouted at me, but I passed down the stairs and out of the house without replying. Part 3. It was past midnight when the telephone rang. I laid down the book I was reading and lowered the receiver. "Hello? Who is there?" I asked. "Frank, this is Howard." The voice was strangely high-pitched. "Come as quickly as you can. They've come back. And Frank, the sign is powerless. I've tried the sign, but the droning is getting louder, and a dim shape—" Howard's voice trailed off disastrously. I fairly screamed into the receiver. "Courage, man! Do not let them suspect that you are afraid. Make the sign again and again. I will come at once. Howard's voice came again, more hoarsely this time. The shape is growing clearer and clearer, and there is nothing I can do. Frank, I have lost the power to make the sign. I have forfeited all right to the protection of the sign. I've become a priest of the devil. That story, I should never have written that story. Show them that you are unafraid, I cried. I'll try. Ah, my God, the shape is... I did not wait to hear more. Frantically seizing my hat and coat, I dashed down the stairs and out into the street. As I reached the curb, a dizziness seized me. I clung to a lamppost to keep from falling, and waved my hand madly at a fleeing taxi. Luckily, the driver saw me. The car stopped, and I staggered out into the street and climbed into it. Quick, I shouted. Take me to 10 Brooklyn Heights. Yes, sir. Cold night, ain't it? Cold, I shouted. It will be cold indeed when they get in. It will be cold indeed when they start to. The driver stared at me in amazement. That's all right, sir, he said. We'll get you home all right, sir. Brooklyn Heights, did you say, sir? Brooklyn Heights. I groaned and collapsed against the cushions. As the car raced forward, I tried not to think of the horror that awaited me. I clutched desperately at straws. It is conceivable, I thought, that Howard has gone temporarily insane. How could the horror have found him among so many millions of people? It cannot be that they have deliberately sought him out. It cannot be that they would deliberately choose him from among such multitudes. He is too insignificant. All human beings are too insignificant. They would never deliberately angle for human beings. They would never deliberately trawl for human beings. But they did seek Henry Wells. And what did Howard say? I have become a priest of the devil. Why not their priest? What if Howard has become their priest on earth? What if his story has made him their priest? The thought was a nightmare to me, and I put it furiously from me. He will have courage to resist them, I thought. He will show them that he is not afraid. Here we are, sir. Shall I help you in, sir? The car had stopped, and I groaned as I realized that I was about to enter what might prove to be my tomb. I descended to the sidewalk and handed the driver all the change that I possessed. He stared at me in amazement. You've given me too much, he said. Here, sir. But I waved him aside and dashed up the stoop of the house before me. As I fitted a key into the door, I could hear him muttering. Craziest drunk I ever seen. He gives me $4 to drive him 10 blocks, and he doesn't want no thanks or nothing. The lower hall was unlighted. I stood at the foot of the stairs and shouted, I'm here, Howard. Can you come down? There was no answer. I waited for perhaps 10 seconds, but not a sound came from the room above. I'm coming up! I shouted in desperation and started to climb the stairs. I was trembling all over. They've got him, I thought. I'm too late. Perhaps I had better not... Great God, what was that? I was unbelievably terrified. There was no mistaking the sounds. In the room above, someone was volubly pleading and crying aloud in agony. Was it Howard's voice that I heard? I caught a few words indistinctly. Crawling! Crawling! Oh, have pity. Cold and clear. Crawling! God in heaven! I had reached the landing, and when the pleadings rose to hoarse shrieks, I fell to my knees and made against my body and upon the wall beside me and in the air the sign. I made the primal sign that had saved us in Mulligan Wood, but this time I made it crudely, not with fire, but with fingers that trembled and caught at my clothes, and I made it without courage or hope, made it darkly, with a conviction that nothing could save me. And then I got up quickly and went on up the stairs. My prayer was that they would take me quickly, and my sufferings should be brief under the stars. The door of Howard's room was ajar. By a tremendous effort, I stretched out my hand and grasped the knob. Slowly, I swung it inward. For a moment I saw nothing but the motionless form of Howard lying upon the floor. He was lying upon his back. His knees were drawn up, and he had raised his hand before his face, palms outward, as if to blot out a vision unspeakable. Upon entering the room, I had deliberately, by lowering my eyes, narrowed my range of vision. I saw only the floor and the lower section of the room. I did not want to raise my eyes. I had lowered them in self-protection, because I dreaded what the room held. I did not want to raise my eyes, but there were forces, powers at work in the room, which I could not resist. I knew that if I looked up, the horror might destroy me, but I had no choice. Slowly, painfully, I raised my eyes and stared across the room. It would have been better, I think, if I had rushed forward immediately and surrendered to the thing that towered there. The vision of that terrible, darkly shrouded shape will come between me and the pleasures of the world as long as I remain in the world. From the ceiling to the floor it towered, and it threw off blinding light, and pierced by the shafts, whirling around and around, were the pages of Howard's story. In the center of the room, between the ceiling and the floor, the pages whirled about, and the light burned through the sheets, and descending in spiraling shafts entered the brain of my poor friend. Into his head the light was pouring in a continuous stream, and above, the master of the light moved with a slow swaying of its entire bulk. I screamed and covered my eyes with my hands, but still the master moved, back and forth, and still the light poured into the brain of my friend. And then there came from the mouth of the master a most awful sound. I had forgotten the sign that I had made 3 times below in the darkness. I had forgotten the high and terrible mystery before which all of the invaders were powerless. But when I saw it forming itself in the room, forming itself immaculately, with a terrible integrity above the downstreaming light, I knew that I was saved. I sobbed and fell upon my knees. The light dwindled, and the master shriveled before my eyes. And then from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor there leapt flame, a white and cleansing flame that consumed, that devoured and destroyed forever. But my friend was dead.